Dr. René Harder Horst is I.G. Greer Distinguished Professor from 2018 to 2021 in History at Appalachian State University in North Carolina, whose research focuses on Latin American history, Native American history, and religious studies. Today, we'll be discussing his book, The Stroessner Regime and Indigenous Resistance in Paraguay, published in 2007 by the University Press of Florida. So thank you for being with me.
You bet.
So how did you get into this topic? And how did you get into your field in general? Like, what made you, like, you said you were born in northern Argentina?
Born in Arizona.
I'm born in Arizona, my bad. Okay, so how did you get into it?
My parents moved to Argentina when I was 3.5 to work among indigenous people in the northern Argentina, Chaco area. And the people were inviting outsiders to support their religious organization, which is called the United Evangelical Church. It's an indigenous church. And there were people from Mennonite background there who were translating the Bible into Com and Mocoy and Pilaga languages. And so my parents joined in 1970, 71, I think we moved there. So I grew up there in Sáenz Peña, Chaco, and then in Formosa province to the north when my parents relocated there a couple of years later. And came back to the United States in the early 80s to go to college, and then went to Indiana University and studied Indigenous history. Studied at Bloomington with Dr. Jeffrey Gould, who worked on Central America, on El Salvador and labor history, but I wanted to do Paraguay because it was less studied, and for me it was what I already knew since I had grown up close there and had friends, and it was since with my Fulbright, I had a limited amount of time and space. It was easier to hit the ground running with somewhere that I already knew. So I traveled and lived for a year in Paraguay between 1994 and 5, and then came back and spent several years writing my dissertation, and then taught at Kalamazoo College for a semester, and then taught at Bates College in Maine for 3 years in a temporary position while I worked on my dissertation, defended, and then got a job at Appalachian State here in Boone, North Carolina, starting in 2000. I've been here ever since, and it's a teaching school, but managed to publish pretty well here anyway. So
yeah, so this book, it says it was published 2007. So but this is based off of your dissertation, or is it?
Yeah, that's my dissertation, and this is a soft cover copy, and then I have a Spanish version of that. I don't know if that's visible or not, but so that's in Spanish, published in Paraguay. And then I decided I did a book on military struggle in Latin America during the so-called liberal period of late 19th, early 20th century. So you get the War of the Pacific and the Chaco War in there, and so World War II, several important conflicts. And I did a chapter on the Chaco War, and for that I went out to the Chaco and interviewed indigenous people in Mariscal Estigarribia in the western Chaco, and enjoyed that a lot. And then I did a study on the Mascoy people who in 1998 actually 1988, able to reclaim their land there in Paraguay, and focused a lot of criticism against the regime in the process. So I interviewed René Ramirez, the Mascoy leader who addressed the Pope in 1988 and brought a lot of negative press against the Stroessner regime. The regime forced him into hiding for 7 or 8 months till the dictator was deposed and fled the country. And then I decided to venture out and broaden my study. And so I have been teaching Indigenous history for many years without a textbook. And so I decided to do a textbook. And the textbook I wrote that I use is called A History of Indigenous Latin America. And it's a 500-year history with one chapter for every 50 years about of chronology. And it's focused on how Indigenous people have changed Latin America and vice versa. It's called Aymara Zapatistas. So from the early people to the recent mobilization there. And I teach a course, History of Indigenous Latin America. It's just a 1-semester course, but we use my textbook and other supplemental texts. And doing that this semester, which is exciting. So I'm currently working on a book that follows my Stroessner regime book, and it's the last 30 years of Paraguay, in which to see what has happened to Indigenous people as Paraguay changes their economy to cattle ranching and soybean plantations. They've displaced between 30 and 40,000 native community people who have come to the cities to live. That's what I'm writing these days. I've been to Paraguay the last 3 summers to do interviews and work in archives and stuff, and excited to get that cranked out.
It sounds very cool. I was like curious because like is it simply because like the Fulbright makes you focus on a particular country that you focused on Paraguay? Because it feels like you could look at it in a couple of different ways. You could do like a regional study of just the Chaco, because really these indigenous groups are crossing borders anyways, and that's their native territory. So what's the reasoning for like doing on like a nation study rather than something more like soy is kind of taken off as like a commodity, do regional studies, or maybe doing a regional study of like the indigenous in the Chaco, that's Argentina, Bolivia, Paraguay?
That's a great question. The studies of the Chaco, there's this book, Reimagining the Chaco, which you're probably familiar with, but that's an anthropological study, and there are fewer regional historical studies on the Chaco, but there are several already, and so that's kind of why I chose not to do that regional one. It was also easier to focus because the Fulbright wants you to do one country. So instead of being able to travel around to Argentina and Bolivia and Brazil, easier to focus on one country for a year to work. Also a little safer. So yeah, lots of considerations, but that's what I ended up with, and been trying to make a career out of it.
So we've talked about this before starting the podcast, and then you've also kind of mentioned it now. What's it like when you initially were starting your research for this book? How was it getting into the archives in Paraguay? Like, what was the most difficult part of the research? And was there any particular moment that you would consider like an aha moment while you were doing the research that like kind of pulled things together?
Let me see. That's a great question, because it's often the case when you go to poorer countries in Latin America that they don't have a lot of money to invest in archives and archival sources and research. And when I did research in '94, that was only 5 years after the regime had collapsed. they had recently found the regime secret files in 92, but those were just like still stacks of moldy papers in crates, and they didn't have a whole lot on indigenous people. So the main challenge for me was to, I guess, just to go through manila folders with loose papers of typewritten stuff. And this was the time before I didn't have a computer. I was taking all my notes by hand in a little one of these paper notebooks, and praying that I wouldn't lose it at the corner or on the way home, So I have 5 of these, and that was my year notes of Fulbright notes for my year, and no pictures or anything. So different day and age. But one aha moment was meeting up with a anthropologist there by the name of Miguel Chasesardi, who worked in Asuncion. His family ran a flower shop. He had been an important catalyst for organization of pro-indigenous. They're called in Paraguay, they call them indigenistas, indigenous people that support and try to encourage indigenous organization, usually very white and affluent enough to have time to mess around and stuff, and usually not with a advanced degree, but just personal interest for some reason. Some of them are ex-priests, some of them are lay people in the church, but met up with him, and he gave me several interviews and encouragement and a lot of names to contact, and through his contact I was able to meet a bunch of people to interview. So I think the other aha was realizing that I could, in addition just to working in the archives, I could interview people, meet them, travel. I visited 5 different indigenous communities throughout the year, and got personal experience. I didn't understand a lot of the language, but studied some Guarani there, and was able to I guess just learn to do ethnohistory, which is a combination of being there and ethnography and anthropology and history, and that made it come alive to me. It also, I think, made it more interesting because people don't really want to publish on Paraguay. There's not a whole lot of market. I just wrote a book for another historian, or a paper for a chapter for another historian who trying to put together a book on Paraguay after Stroessner. Nobody wants to publish it. There's just no market for books on Paraguay very much. So you might have to end up publishing chapters of your dis in journals rather than as an entire book. But hopefully you can piece together your with your interest and focus on co-ops, that might and if you put it together with
I think the Mennonite aspect is what's going to be the selling point to publishers. So yeah, it's either got to be Nazis or Mennonites.
Nazi Mennonites, but the communal thing could be interesting too, because the whole idea of cooperativism versus individual capitalism, and how that differs in the Chaco, and yet doesn't, because it's communal work, but it's for capitalist goals. And so as you kind of disentangle and analyze that could be a strong selling point for your work, especially there's a Herald Press that publishes Mennonite books.
Right, yeah.
That might be very interested in your work as well.
Yeah.
Next question.
So we also briefly talked about this before, but what does it mean to be indigenous in Paraguay? How do you determine when to generalize, talking about the indigenous communities in Paraguay, and when to be specific, like talking about the Arayo or I'm probably pronouncing all of these horribly, but the
Aros, Ayoreo,
Ajareo, or
there you
like
go.
the Nivkale,
Nivacle,
Nivkale, Niv,
Nivacle,
Nivakle.
there you go.
Okay.
Nivacle, yeah.
So when do you generalize? When do you specify?
So if you're trying to talk about them as a group, as indigenous people, indigenas, they would say in Spanish. And that's just a generic for people that Paraguayans consider to be native, right? Um, and then within that generalization umbrella, there's 17 different peoples. So and those peoples would each consider themselves to be that people or nation or group, So if they will say, I'm in shit, or I'm in clit, or I'm nivacle, or I'm Aba Guarani, and but the interesting dynamic about Paraguay is that the peasantry, that is poor Paraguayans from rural areas, they're all descended from the Guarani. And the point where that was differentiated was in starting in the 17th century with the Jesuit missions that culminate in the 18th century. So in the 1760s, when Spain evicts the Jesuits from their territories because they're becoming more regalist and want to have authority over the church, so they expel the Jesuits from all their. This is when the armies. I'm sure you've seen the mission, right? This is when the armies came in and forced the native peoples to leave the missions. As they leave the missions where they had lived, for generations, they become the peasantry, the poor Paraguayans that live in the countryside, speak Guarani, are indigenous, but no longer consider themselves part of one of the indigenous peoples. Because as they're trying to assume a Spanish identity, it's depreciative for them to say, I'm Mba or Ava Guarani anymore, because we're now Paraguayans. So that's the 18th century context when that happened. So after that, the people in rural Paraguay, in the east at least, would have considered themselves Paraguayan instead of indigenous. But the people that had never been part of the missions and those communities continued their indigenous identity. So if you go to Asuncion today, as you will with your Fulbright, then you will, or you probably, when you were there before, you see native people in the city. The Macau women selling trinkets on the airport or at the marketplace, and other Guarani people, and you can tell distinctly who they are because they will look different and they identify differently than the majority Paraguayans. Even though the majority Paraguayans may look, phenotypically as indigenous as you can imagine, because that's their heritage, but they don't consider themselves to be indigenous, and would consider it insulting to be called indigenous as well. So it's a self-identity. If the person is from a native community, maybe has been displaced, had to move to the capital, but still feels indigenous, then they will identify as indigenous. And what's the autonymic? It's the auto designation that they use. Yeah.
And I've read, I haven't actually experienced this, but I've read that there's actually, even within Latin American or in Paraguayan society, that different indigenous groups are kind of viewed better or worse, even within the indigenous community, where it's like Guarani are like kind of in a privileged state, and then the kind of the further away from eastern, like towards the Chaco, like the further away is the worse they're viewed.
Yeah, it's hierarchical because the Guarani are viewed more positively because it's their language that the nation has adopted as their bilingual language, right? And Paraguay is the only bilingual nation in Latin America with two official languages. Even though the Tupi-Guarani people had lived all along the Atlantic coast of Brazil, right, in colonial times and pre-colonial times, but in Brazil, the use of Guarani lasted into the early 19th century, but then died off. And so they lost that bilingual sort of character there along the Atlantic coast. But Paraguay kept it. And I argue that it's because of both the War of Triple Alliance, the Paraguayan War, and the Chaco War, that it endured because this allowed Paraguay to distinguish itself as kind of this little nation among neighboring bullies and giants, right? And so we have the Guarani gives us a unique identity.
Interesting. So to what extent did the lack of government support lead to underdevelopment for indigenous communities in Paraguay? And to what extent would you say, like, on the other hand, government support of the Mennonites led to their development? So there's been an argument that the main reason for Mennonite development in the Chaco is the Trans-Chaco Highway, that you don't have the highway for the market to the capital. The Mennonite cooperatives, they're not going to be successful. So how much merit do you think is in this?
That's a good question.
This idea.
I think the answer is yes, because there's been very little government support for Native communities, but culturally they're very different. The Mennonites came from Canada and from Russia or from Ukraine, and they had a very capitalist mentality already when they came. So it was a lot easier for them to move directly into ranching and dairy products, where the Native people from there, they did not come from a capitalist background. They hunted and gathered for self-sustenance only and not as part of a broader market. And so it was culturally very difficult for them to fit into a capitalist model of production, and not just any capitalist model, but a cattle ranching and farming mentality. It was culturally very different. So culture makes a huge difference, and I think that especially Wilmer Stahl, the social anthropologist that I talked to you about, has work on that analysis and how the different cultures made a difference as to what these different groups did in the culture, in the Chaco economically.
Okay, this is maybe a little bit of a complicated question, or well, we'll see. To what extent
more than the others?
To what extent do you say that there's culpability in Mennonite or other immigrant communities who arrived to Paraguay and did actually displace indigenous communities? So on the one hand, it's not right that indigenous communities were displaced, but a lot of that was due to the Paraguayan state. And a lot of the times I've found, at least from what I've studied, immigrant communities were kind of also being used by the Paraguayan state. So like we even briefly talked about, so the Mennonites were kind of used by the Paraguayan state to stake claims, territorial claims in the Chaco. But there's a lot of discussion amongst Mennonites in Canada about feeling guilt for displacing indigenous communities. So to what extent do you think there's culpability in these immigrant communities coming and displacing indigenous communities when we're working within like a nation state framework.
Okay, where do you
Both
publish a podcast?
YouTube.
Who's gonna read this?
Well, I can edit this part out if you don't want. That's why I was saying it was like a little bit
Okay,
it
because
might be a tricky question.
yeah, here's the scoop, Samuel. So the issue is that the Paraguayan state in the 30s put Mennonite on land that was probably at some point used by indigenous people. But they certainly didn't have land titles to the land. It wasn't like they owned it legally. And so with that in mind, Mennonites didn't technically take indigenous land at that point when they were first settled. The fact that there are thousands of indigenous people now at the Mennonite colonies is because they came there looking for work. So that's not the Mennonites' fault necessarily. I mean, they had labor. The native people came looking for labor because they couldn't survive elsewhere. And now there's a lot of lower class indigenous people looking for work in the Mennonite communities. So that's also not technically Mennonite's fault. So here's where I can get into trouble, but I think it could have been very different results had Mennonites not been so racist against indigenous peoples. Were they going to give up all their land for native peoples to settle? That doesn't seem capitalistically logical or to be expected, because the Paraguayan government had put them and given them that land and put them there. It's kind of like expecting Israel to give all its land to the Palestinian people, or the Palestinian just to give up its claim just because Israel has biblical stories that say that they own the land. So most of the native people at the colonies came later to the colonies in search of labor. So they weren't technically displaced by the Mennonites. But what has happened in the last 30 years, and what I'm writing about now, is that Mennonites have incredibly extended their land holdings beyond the original colonies, right?
Mm-hmm.
So Mennonite ranchers are deforesting in land that has been set aside legally for native peoples. And they're above the law because nobody in the Paraguayan government can touch what they do. So in that sense, for me, there's nothing moral or justified in Mennonites clearing forested land and destroying indigenous communities just so they can extend ranching. Even if they do have a legal claim to that land or can purchase it, why is it not up to the native people to decide their culture and their way of life, right? So why should it be up to Mennonite ranchers to say that it's inevitable that indigenous people will have to join capitalist society and live like we say they should live, or live like we want them to in a modern society?
Mm-hmm.
So co-ops have worked for us Mennonites, but does that mean that indigenous people should and need to form co-ops just because that's the best way for them to live, even if it's way culturally different from their fitting into a capitalist society? I don't know if that all makes sense, but
yeah, no, I'm picking up what you're putting down.
Okay.
So I think in the book, one thing I was really impressed with is I think you do a good job of displaying indigenous agency in resistance rather than just there being this narrative of them just constantly being attacked and not doing anything about it. What do you think, like, what should be kept in mind, like, if I'm doing my dissertation when discussing such issues to present a good balance between uh, just showing that they were oppressed, but also showing their agency? Like, how do you get that balance?
That's a great question. First of all, you have to figure out what it is that they're doing and why they might be thinking that, right? So as you read the news, as you read the Mennonite archives, as you read the Paraguayan news, you'll have to try to read between the lines to figure out what Native people are doing and why they might be doing that, right? Because Indigenous people will talk to the press. It's usually heavily edited. They will go on a march, for example, and you might be able to understand, well, they're protesting because they want this plot of land saved for them or something. But it's rare that they will sit down and give you a long explanation of what exactly it is, what they want and why. So as an ethnohistorian, you're going to have to figure out the best you can from the sources. But as in my book, what I tried to do was just to keep in mind that Indigenous people are historical actors just like everybody else. And while they may not be literate or writing down their goals, they certainly as a people have goals and are historical actors, and that they're trying to change the situation to support and improve their own living conditions, to perpetuate their family structures and their ways of life, their cultures. And this is all part of what it is to be a people, right? And so yeah, I would suggest reading some ethnohistory, reading up how to figure out the combination of culture and historical events, and then figuring out how to put that together in your narrative. So I can foresee maybe a combination of some anthropological study of these people in the Central Chaco, as well as an anthropological understanding of Mennonite cooperativism on your behalf, and then how these two are similar or not similar, and how they fit together in the Chaco context.